YouTube, and I am here today with a very special guest, someone who I've worked with a lot and am currently working with right now. That is Isa Noyola.
Yes.
And so Isa is one of my favorite people, and you're about to learn why. You're very fortunate to have her here today. So Isa, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from, what some of your passions are, what inspires you?
Well, I'm from Mexico. My family is from Comitán, Chiapas, and from San Luis Potosí. I was born in Texas, and then my family moved to the Bay Area in the 80s. So we've been here ever since. I've lived all over in the East Bay. My parents are pastors of a church, primarily immigrant church here in Richmond and the Bay. And yeah, I've just grown up all over the East Bay, and I love it here in San Francisco Bay Area.
And so you and I met when we were both working on the Transform SF program, which is the HIV testing program based in San Francisco, and it's specifically targeting transgender women of color.
Yeah.
And so you at the time were working with, and you probably still are, but Ella ParaTransit.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Ella ParaTransit is an agency that's located in the heart of the Mission in San Francisco. We serve trans, primarily immigrant Latina women. Our program is primarily a Spanish-speaking Spanish program. It's bilingual as well too. We have workshops and cultural events, all geared towards the Latina immigrant community. It's a holistic program. We started out as an HIV prevention program, but has since developed because of the needs of the community are many. And so we do community engagement, political education, cultural, spiritual, holistic services and activities.
Yeah, well, it's really wrap around, and one of the things I loved about being at Ella was really the supportive environment. I felt like every time I walked into the space, I was coming into people's home. Yeah. It was like being in a living room.
I mean, that's definitely our aim, is that at least for myself, it's a home away from home. And for so many of our community members, that it is a place where we've set it up to feel that way intentionally. Folks come in and are able to relate to each other. And I think it's just really important within trans communities that we create spaces, intentional spaces, because there are very few and far between. So it was important for us to really set up the space and to really create that family atmosphere. You know, when you walk in, they offer you immediately like a cup of coffee and a little like sweet bread, and you're just there to, there's always something going on there. So engaging in a workshop, or just hanging out in the kitchen, seeing a case manager, or getting HIV testing.
That's what I did. So now you're also here at the Transgender Law Center, which is where we're right now. So you're getting a special view into the Transgender Law Center. So tell me a little bit about what you do for the Transgender Law Center.
So I've been here since October, and the two key issues that I work and mobilize around policy and advocacy are around immigration and also violence against trans communities. So there's just definitely a lot to do, and there's so much nationally that is happening around both issues, right? We know that violence is a huge issue within our trans communities, and in a lot of ways, a lot of the work I do really overlaps and intersects because the ways in which I'm engaged in the immigrant rights movement building and organizing efforts is around trans women in detention and all of the state violence that they experience inside detention centers. So there's a lot of the ways in which I think defining violence is not just through sort of the physical transphobic assaults that are a lot of our communities experience in the street and the murder, but also state-sanctioned violence that our communities are experiencing inside the detention centers.
Right, yeah, so really expanding the definition to be more inclusive of all the types of violence that our community faces.
Yeah.
You mentioned the detention centers, and I know you've done some really amazing work that's been getting a lot of traction around immigration and customs enforcement, which is ICE, commonly referred to as ICE. And so recently you were involved in a protest.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what you did and what was the impact? What happened?
Yeah. So there was an action at the Santa Ana GBT pod, which is a immigration customs detention center. They contract them out, Santa Ana County Jail. And there's a pod where trans and queer folks are transferred there from other detention centers. And Santa Ana, in a lot of ways, has been heralded as like sort of the model facility for the treatment of trans and queer folks inside detention centers. So a lot of their policies and a lot of things that happen inside detention centers, this facility has been sort of like, this is the model around the existing policies around that exist, that ICE has. The action that I was a part of was to really, was a part of the Not One More campaign that really kind of was really kind of bringing to light the situations that occur inside detention centers, all the violence and the torture and the rape that our communities experience. And we wanted to use Santa Ana as an example, because definitely Santa Ana is not the only place that this happens. Across the board in many states, in many detention centers, trans folks are there. And so we wanted to highlight the violence that is happening. And so I was arrested and I was booked and released that later later that day, but
definitely go for a second.
It was, I mean, it's definitely not a sort of pleasant experience. Of course, there's a lot of transphobia that happens throughout the booking process, being referred to as a male, being referred to the guards not respecting my name or my gender identity or pronouns, being, just like, in a lot of ways realizing how their definition and their limitations around gender diversity and our trans communities. And I was only there, I didn't even, it was all of this violence happened, and the transphobia happened just even within that booking process. And so
that's just the start.
That's just the start. Yeah.
So you mentioned some of the violence that goes on inside of these detention centers, and I recently heard some very disturbing statistics around, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'd heard that 1 in 500 approximately people coming into the country seeking asylum but being detained by ICE identify as transgender. So 1 in 500. However, 1 in 5 sexual assaults that happen within ICE's custody happen against transgender women.
Yeah, and so what's interesting about those two stats that most media uses and news reports uncovering this issue is that, one, ICE doesn't collect this data. And so this data is actually not super accurate.
Okay.
So of the known folks that have identified and disclosed of their trans identity, so that number it's potentially a lot bigger.
Okay.
And in terms of the cases of sexual assault, those are only reported cases. So there's so many cases that have not been followed up on, that folks have not reported because of of experiencing the violence. And so to report would mean to draw more attention and to potentially be more vulnerable to more violence and more transphobia. So those stats actually could be a lot higher, and we don't know the severity and the depth to of what it really looks like. Recently, ICE released a set of guidelines for transgender detainees.
And this was all new.
This is all new. That came out last week, and in that in those guidelines and policies are around data collection and sort of capturing trans identities within like the booking and the processing of folks.
Yeah, that's a lot of the work that I'm actually doing here at TLC over the summer is around data collection on transgender individuals. And if you don't ask the questions that get you a means of identifying whether or not somebody is trans or not, then you have no way of knowing what's happening.
So, so nobody really knows how many trans folks are inside detention centers right now.
Wow. So I mean, so that's a huge part of what you're doing. But I also saw something from you recently. I believe it was on the Huffington Post, where you had written sort of a response to the Obama heckler, as the media was loving to call her. So I've already explained on my channel sort of what had happened, but maybe you can give a little summary and your response to that.
So it was actually an op-ed in the Advocate.
The Advocate.
Yeah, and we, so Genesis Gutierrez is a trans Latina undocumented woman who has been very much been working closely with her in a lot of the mobilization and community grassroots efforts. Primarily in Southern California, she was part of the recent action in Santa Ana. And so her interrupting the president and really raising the issue of trans women in detention and the violence and torture and rape that folks are experiencing was really a really important pivotal moment. And for folks, I think, that are not really involved in the immigrant rights sort of policies and all of the different behind the scenes work, I could definitely see the sort of view of like this moment being rude or sort of uncivilized, but it really fails to capture actually a lot of the work that has been going into this issue, a lot of the polite conversations and meetings and sort of formal formalities with ICE and sort of all of these policy pieces that are happening both with the the legal experts and advocates on the ground that have been really trying to address this issue from many different ways. And so from Geneset's perspective as an undocumented trans Latina who is impacted by the violence, who is impacted by the deportation machine, that moment was really in line with the voices inside detention centers. And it was really her uplifting all of those voices and saying, enough is enough. We are not disposable, and our communities deserve so much more, and like this issue needs to be elevated. And there's in her voice, in that cry, there was a sense of urgency around folks really need to really understand what's happening, how the state is enacting this violence on a daily basis. And folks don't even realize it.
It was no one was focusing on it. No one was paying any attention. And then the main criticism that's leveraged against her is, well, it wasn't the time. That was rude. It was uncivil. But as you mentioned, there's been just work and screaming and shouting, but it's
and protests and rallies and
nothing
closed door meetings and sign-on letters. There's been multiple tactics and strategies to bring this issue to light and to really address all of the multiple ways our community is being harmed. And I think that it was just an important moment for our communities to feel seen in those spaces where we're often not seen, where we're often not invited, we're often an afterthought in these large spaces where primarily it's like cis folks, primarily it's non-trans women of color. There's in doing this work, I would say most of the time I'm navigating by myself. I am one of a handful of trans women of color, trans Latina women speaking on this issue, and so to see Geneset, to see actually any trans woman of color, and to see trans folks really bring light to our issues, to our community's needs, is so much needed right now in terms of all of the efforts that are taking place.
Well, I think one of the common things that I see between you and Geneset is the bravery and the willingness to sort of step up and take a risk.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's calling out the president or protesting and getting arrested, like these things, these are not easy things to do, but they're calling attention to such important issues.
Yeah.
So if you could give people watching this a way to get involved, something that they can do, what can we do to help fight this, to help fix some of these problems?
I would say, one, I think there's, for anyone, I think that there's just a need to understand the ways in which immigration has played out in the U.S. And there's a long history, right? And so to understand that history first, to really then put into context what's happening now. Because what's happening now is not new, and sort of the criminalization or sort of non-response from the U.S. government or, you know, the president's administration, there's a longer history. So one, like, is really to understand that, and that information is really accessible online. Two, understand who's doing on the ground grassroots mobilization, and to really understand those organizations, and they all have different campaigns, strategies, sign-on letters, protests and rallies. This week is the Not One More week of action. Across the United States, there's a variety of organizations and groups doing actions in different parts of the country. Up the campaign of Not One More deportation, Not One More person in detention centers, and the end of criminalization of our communities. Familia Transgender Immigration is an amazing LGBT immigrant rights organization. Song, Southerners on New Ground, Immigrant Youth Coalition, California, Immigrant Youth Coalition, QUIP, Queer and Undocumented Immigrant Project. There's many organizations across the U.S. that are LGBT immigrant rights that are led by the community and a base of those folks most impacted by this issue. And I would say, to me, that is key. I think in all of the work, I solely and wholeheartedly believe in people power and community power, because I think that we start to see then when our communities engage in this way, when we're speaking truth to power, we're seeing that this momentum and this pressure is being built around needing to redefine and needing to really redefine our ideas of liberation and freedom, and not just sort of through necessarily policies or legal sort of protections, but our vision should actually be a little more ample and include everyone. And I think that's why the Not One More campaign is, a lot of these organizations are under this, are really supportive of this campaign, because it really, in a lot of ways, doesn't throw anyone under the bus in terms of its political articulation of the issue.
Right. And people can find more about Not One More by going to a hashtag.
Yes, hashtag Not One More. They have their own page as well in the Not One More campaign. And there's just so much to do. I know that grassroots efforts are underway to continue pushing around the issue of transgender communities inside detention centers. And you know, the fight continues. Our communities are struggling and fighting every day, because the fact of the matter is that currently today there's trans folks experiencing the violence inside detention centers.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
And for taking the time to sit down with me and share all of your experience and your knowledge with everyone. It's been really wonderful. If you could leave everyone with a parting message, what would it be?
I would say that our community is resilient. Having visited inside detention centers and going and visiting our community, you know, it's so amazing for me to see how our communities are still resisting inside detention centers, for the strength that our women, for our community members to exhibit and still want to fight and say, no, actually, I'm not going to be dehumanized. I'm going to resist. I'm going to live my authentic self and say, yes, I'm transgender. I am a proud trans Latina immigrant person, and I deserve dignity and respect. And so that message I share with all of you, because it is an important message that we all need to embrace and know that even though we face hostile sort of conditions, even outside detention centers, that we are, we are a resilient community. Our community has existed in every single civilization, and I think that we hold a lot of the keys to a lot of these problems that we're seeing. So
we do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Again, this is Aaron, aka Grishno. This has been a fantastic, wonderful interview with Isa.
Thank you.
So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing all the great things that you're going to do.
Thank
in the future.
you. Bye.
Bye.